This is the Nikon Z6III, the latest addition to Nikon's full-frame mirrorless lineup. It boasts a 24-megapixel sensor, a new processor, much improved autofocus, and it can record a mind-blowing 6K raw video internally at up to 60 frames per second. Best yet, it does all of this at a price point of just $2,500. While it may sound a bit extreme, I truly think that this is the most important Nikon camera, and it might just save the brand. Let me explain. A quick disclaimer, Nikon did loan me the Z6III to test out, but they've never paid me, they have no say in what I say, and they don't get to see this video before you do. So before we get into why this camera is such a big deal, it's important to take a trip down memory lane and understand Nikon's journey in the mirrorless and video market. Nikon was notably slow to adopt mirrorless technology and video capabilities. Back in 2018, they finally released the original Z7 and Z6, but let's not forget they were still rolling out high-end DSLRs as late as 2017 with the D850. While the Z7 and Z6 were decent cameras, the specs were lacking in a few crucial categories, and the Z-mount mirrorless system was far behind the likes of Sony and others. During this time, interest in Nikon saw a steady decline and stock price followed a similar trend. A huge number of new creatives were entering the scene as photo and video work became increasingly important. This is where the branding issues kind of began for Nikon. Their user base was mostly established photographers who had been shooting with Nikon for ages, primarily still using DSLRs. Nikon's slow adoption to the cool new mirrorless tech and lack of competitive video specs made them less appealing to the younger generation of photographers and videographers. Their overall share of the camera market began to decline as their target audience ages up and there's no newer folks kind of coming in to replace them.
They can. Don't you realize Nikon, the huge international corporation, they have millions of customers that make tons of money.
Nikon still makes around $4.9 billion per year in revenue. They're not going bankrupt or failing anytime soon. But I worked at Google for a decade consulting some of the world's largest brands on their search and advertising businesses, and I can tell you that any one of them that saw a chart that looked like this would have considered it a huge problem. This is a common problem for established brands. As their core market ages, they want to be sure that they're replaced with newer folks. They want to be like BMW, not Oldsmobile. Now, Nikon made some significant strides in BMWing themselves with the release of the Z9 and the Z8, both fantastic high-end pro-level cameras. And then, of course, there's the acquisition of Red, which helps Nikon in a few major ways. It allows them to enter the cinema market. They also get access to internal compressed raw video recording because Red owned the patent to this, and they're able to borrow from Red's brand as a hip, tech-forward company. While the Red acquisition is still fresh and the tech hasn't fully been integrated into something like the Z6III, we do still get NRAW, which gives them a huge leg up in the hybrid camera space. You make a good product, you give it to creative people and tastemakers, and you let them say what they want about it. And if the product is good enough, good things will happen. So is the Nikon Z6III good enough? Honestly, yes. I have been shooting on it extensively since it arrived, and I do have some thoughts. Let's start off with the highlights, and then I'll talk about some of the shortcomings. The Z6III is built around a new 24.5 megapixel partially stacked sensor, which helps with the readout speed. And then it's paired with the XPEED 7 processor, the same that we get in the much pricier Z8 and Z9. This combination allows for impressive speed and performance, something that Nikon has needed to address to catch up with competitors like Sony and Canon. Now you can capture up to 14 frames per second with mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second with electronic shutter. One of the most significant improvements is the autofocus system, which inherits the advanced 3D tracking and subject detection from the flagships, the Z8 and the Z9. This makes the Z6III incredibly reliable for tracking moving subjects, whether you're shooting sports, automotive, wildlife, or other fast-paced things that you could think of. Having been a Sony shooter for years, I'll say that the autofocus controls do take some fine tuning, and the customization of the menus is a little bit cumbersome at first, but now that I have all of my function and autofocus buttons customized, it is pretty freaking epic. If you want a video breaking down each of these settings, let me know in the comments. For videographers, the Z6III offers a range of options that elevate it above most of its peers. As I mentioned off the top, It can record 6K video at up to 60 frames per second in NRAW with NLOG and no crop. And it does all of that internally without needing something like an Atomos, again, thanks to that Red acquisition that we talked about earlier. Note that you will burn through media very quickly when using the RAW recording, so you'll need a high-capacity CF Express card, which is not cheap. I found the NRAW to be super pleasing to work with. I know Gerald's tests have found that the dynamic range is lower than a lot of other cameras, but in practical use cases, for me, it's been great. You can also record ProRes or H.265 if you're keen on not spending a bunch of money on a CF Express card. And if you need more than 60 frames per second, then the Z6III supports 4K at 120 frames with a 1.5 crop, and you can shoot 240 frames per second at 1080, which is dope if you have something that you really want to slow down. If you're someone who's into video, then you know the importance of sound design, which is why I've worked with an audio engineer to create a Whoosh sound effects pack. It is completely free to download at the link in the description, but as a free way to say thank you, you could hit the subscribe button. Now, there's a lot of cameras in this price range that have impressive spec sheets, but the manufacturers end up skimping out somewhere in order to keep the cost down or artificially protect their flagships. Looking at you, Canon. Or heck, honestly, many Sony cameras also tend to cheap out on their viewfinders for the lower price cameras as well. But with the Z6III, we somehow get basically none of that. The overall build is robust, it's weather sealed, and it has a really nice feel in the hand, although I do prefer the larger grip on the Z8. The EVF, holy heck, it's probably the best EVF I've ever used. It's almost twice the resolution of the Z8, and it has a max brightness of 4,000 nits. That's literally twice as bright as the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Like, that's like sticking the iPhone 15 Pro Max up to your eye, two of them. It's crazy. It also has a really nice flippy LCD screen, which I know is controversial, and for many that might mean that you're gonna completely rule this camera out, but flippy screens are far better for video, and this camera is clearly targeted at hybrid or video shooters, so get over it. They didn't skimp on any of the other often skimped things either. It has full-size HDMI, a line audio input that doesn't get in the way of that flippy screen, wireless timecode, USB-C power delivery, dual card slots, although there's some issues with the dual card slots that we'll get to in a second. This honestly feels like it's a $3,500 camera, but it's $1,000 cheaper. Having all of this performance and features at the $2,500 price point is why I think this is going to be the most important camera for Nikon. Historically, hybrid cameras at this price point are winners. The best-selling camera in 2022 and 2023 was the A7 IV, which costs $2,500. The Sony A7 III was the best-selling camera for 4 years in a row a little bit prior to that, which cost $2,000 at the launch in 2018. And if you adjust for inflation, that would actually be $2,489 today. But that is a topic for, we're not opening that can of worms in this video. We're just not doing it. If I was a gambling man, I would guess that the Nikon Z6III is going to make a challenge for that top spot in 2024, maybe 2025. And that's exactly what Nikon needs to turn it around and really establish itself as a major contender in the mirrorless market. Now, is the Z6III perfect? No. There's no ability to do dual video recording on two cards, which could be a deal breaker for those of you who require redundancy. As I mentioned before, the dynamic range is definitely not best in class, but again, I personally found it to be pretty sufficient in most scenarios. Nikon's image stabilization, certainly good, but it does fall short compared to Panasonic and Sony. The new autofocus system is definitely a huge improvement upon previous Nikons, but it's a little bit overcomplicated, it misses a little bit more than it should, and there's no one setting that works perfectly in all situations like you'd have on other cameras. To me, the biggest shortcoming is still that Nikon is a little bit behind in terms of the Z-mount lenses. Yes, you can adapt older lenses, but in 2024, this should not be a requirement anymore. Yes, they're making strides to build out the lineup, and optically, the lenses they do have are fantastic. But in my mind, Sony still wins out in terms of native selection, number of third-party options, price options, and size. Like, don't get me wrong, this 50mm f1.2, fantastic lens, but it's 40% heavier than the Sony counterpart. But again, I think that Nikon hit it out of the park with this camera, and I do think it will sell really well. And I'm excited to see how other brands respond, because in the end, when these brands start duking it out, we're the real winners. All right, I'll see you next week. Peace.